Just giving people a moment to trickle in. Okay, great. I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Bolus. I'm the Senior Programs and Communications Associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or TIMEUP. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our newest virtual panel, Youth Climate Advocacy, Organizing and Demands Ahead of COP27. Young people around the world are on the front lines of those demanding bold climate action to safeguard their future, particularly as the impacts of climate change intensify year by year. Nowhere is this dynamic felt more acutely than in the MENA region, which is already severely impacted by the effects of climate change and where approximately 2/3 of the region are under 35 years old. It's these future generations that will continue to disproportionately feel the impacts of climate change, but it's also young people in the region who are taking action and leveraging their skills and the limited available resources for climate change advocacy more than ever through knowledge production, technical interventions, campaigning, and protest. Today, ahead of the United Nations Climate Change Conference, or COP27, our panelists will address questions such as, how are youth climate advocates organizing and innovating in the MENA region for climate justice? How are MENA youth advocates expecting to engage around COP27? And critically, what steps must be taken to ensure that youth expertise, perspectives, and demands be centered in climate policy making more generally? Before we begin, I want to remind our audience of a few things. As always, today's conversation is being recorded and will be shared widely after the panel. You can follow along and live tweet with us using the hashtag #TimeUpEvents, and we invite our audience to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A function at any point. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's wonderful moderator, Malek El-Taib. Malek is a non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute focusing on food security in North Can everyone hear me? I'm not sure where I got cut off.
Yeah, we can hear you. You just were cut off introducing me just in the beginning, and then we lost you. So
I'm so sorry. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Malek El-Taib. Malek, the floor is yours, and I meant to pass on moderation to you. So please take it from here, Malek. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey, and welcome everyone to our speakers and also the audience to our session today to discuss youth climate advocacy in the MENA region ahead of COP27. As you know, climate change has increased levels of uncertainty about our future. As its effects intensify over time, young people are becoming increasingly aware of the challenges and risks posed by the climate crisis, as well as of the opportunity to achieve sustainable development through solutions to climate change. Young people are not just victims of climate change, they're also important contributors to climate action. It's essential today that we discuss climate advocacy and activism from a MENA perspective. And I'm so excited to highlight our speakers today and to discuss with them this topic ahead of COP, since COP27 is hosted in Egypt and will start in only a couple of days. So without further ado, let me introduce our speakers. First, we have Nisa Beck. Nisa is a climate activist and the founder of Project Mulan, which is a youth-led project that aims to achieve the UNDP's Sustainable Development Goals in Libya. In 2021, Nisa was Libya's representative in Youth for Climate's Driving Ambition at the pre-COP in Milan. We also have Nisreen Al-Sa'am. Nisreen is a climate activist, the chair of Sudan Youth Organization on Climate Change, and the chair of the UN Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change. We also have Rawat Kefi. She is a PhD student in Intercultural Studies and Environmental Humanities. She is the project coordinator of Children of the Earth Network NGO, Réseau Enfants de la Terre, based in Tunisia, and a member in the group of non-negotiators on climate change in the Tunisian delegation. Finally, we have Gina Telj. Gina is a marine biologist, founder and director of Diaries of the Ocean, an environmental NGO in Lebanon that works on marine biodiversity conversation. Thank you all, and I'm so excited to start the round of questions. Again, I want to remind our audience to submit your questions to our speakers in the Q&A box. And the session will run for about 90 minutes, so timing is going to be very crucial in the session. So let me start with the first question to all of our speakers. But let me first start with Gina. Each of you are working on remarkable initiatives for climate justice, often led by youth advocates and activists such as yourselves. Can you please tell us a bit about the space you're working in as a climate advocate, and what is the role of youth in climate advocacy, especially in the MENA region? So Gina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Malak. First of all, I'm very happy to be here, so thank you very much. Today, and especially among marginalized youth in Lebanon, I'm going to focus on Lebanon first. There is increased stewardship of natural resources through innovative solutions that are contributing to sustainable development. Perhaps it is because of all the crises that we have been facing over and over in the past years. Young people are taking it upon themselves to fix things because there's no one else to do that for them. So young individuals are developing creative ideas to solve environmental problems in their communities, with NGOs and international organizations providing them with much needed training sessions, job opportunities, funding in the areas of climate change and the environment. The youth of Lebanon have the potential to come up with creative ideas to solve these problems in ways that we have never thought of before, not only in climate advocacy, but also in more practical areas of the climate dilemma as well. So youth are taking action on climate change mitigation and adaptation. Diverse initiatives include educational, awareness raising, behavioral change campaigns. They engage in climate change projects within different national and international organizations. And many young individuals are also training to become climate negotiators for their governments. Lebanon, Jordan, and Libya are engaged in a climate negotiator program where 3 young people from each of these countries are being trained to become official negotiators. There are also 5 Lebanese youth attending the COP27 later this week. As far as I know, there are 5, maybe there are others. On the other hand, there's also a group of young people in Lebanon engaged in a program with UNICEF. A few of Diaries of the Ocean's youth, the organization that I represent, are also involved in this program. They have mapped all climate policies in Lebanon, and over a few weeks, they suggested new policies and policies that they thought are lacking. One point I would like to emphasize here is that they suggested stricter policies for coastal zone management and disaster risk reduction due to storms and extreme weather events, as well as measures to protect vulnerable coastal communities. These are urgent topics that are rarely discussed in climate negotiations.
Thank you so much, Gina, for giving us this overview of your work as a climate activist from a marine perspective. But the same question will go now to Rawa. So can you please tell us, Rawa, about your work as a climate advocate from a Tunisian experience? And in your opinion, what is the role of youth in climate advocacy? So Rawa, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Malek. Thank you everyone for hosting this event. Thank you for the participants who joined us today. And I believe this is like a very good warm-up before COP for me at least, because I'm traveling tomorrow. And so, speaking about climate justice, I believe that climate justice is first and foremost about inclusivity. So basically, nothing for us, I mean, youth, can occur without us. And in Tunisia, especially after 2011, we had somehow an enabling environment that has allowed us to be more vocal as climate activists. On the other hand, we managed to take a step forward, and we seized the opportunity to cut with the narrative of vulnerability or youth being, victims, towards another situation of leadership and resilience, where I believe we succeeded, though not without the challenges, to be in the table. I mean, not just sitting around watching what is going on out there, but rather we came up to the table with ideas and perspectives. So here I'm speaking about our experience of the group of young negotiators on climate change. So it was an initiative that was launched last year by the Ministry of the Environment in partnership with the GIZ Tunisia to build the capacity of youth on climate negotiations, so that we will be able to support the delegation in conference of parties as well as SBs to cover as much as thematic areas as possible. Now, being a negotiator does not mean that I'm giving up on my status as a climate activist in civil society. So I'm currently, as you said, the project coordinator of Réseau Enfants de la Terre. We are interested in education for sustainable development, which actually echoes my area of interest in COP, that is Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE. And for the moment, I'm glad to announce that we are working in partnership with the UNICEF on a project. It's called the Youth Participatory Research Action. And so I'm trying to transmit what I have already acquired in my previous training, including climate negotiations, to build the capacities of youth or young researchers, and to mobilize them to first train other youth like themselves in local communities, so that we are here speaking about some kind of peer-to-peer training. And second, to inquire about how climate change is affecting their region. So basically now we have like 240 trained young researchers from each district in Tunisia, and we are aiming to reach 5,000 young people as interviewees. So the answers will be scientifically collected and analyzed, and hopefully the output of this research action will nurture the national strategy on children's rights and climate change in Tunisia. So basically here, this is an initiative that is by youth and for youth. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rawa, and thank you for highlighting the important role of youth as drivers for action, and not only especially like in the region. And when we talk about Tunisia and after 2011, it's essential to highlight the role of youth and how empowered and powerful they have been throughout this critical time. The same question will go now to Nisa. Can you tell us from your experience working as a climate activist in Libya, and the importance of the role of youth in climate advocacy and activism?
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you so much for having me. I would say that we need youth more than ever, especially in Libya. I've been listening to a lot of the groups who are actually heading to COP from Tunisia, from Egypt, from other countries as well, and how active they are and what are they doing to put together policies, and how are they planning to basically advocate to whatever issues they're facing in their home countries. But so far, there's really nothing in Libya. There's one representative who's going, and he's doing his best really to sort of reach out and make sure that a couple of Libyans receive badges to actually attend. And the funny thing that it was his initiative. He actually attended a conference in Bonn, and he ended up meeting one of the delegation or person who's going with the delegation of Libya to COP, and they just like bonded a bit over some coffee. And then he literally asked him, "Can I have a badge?" And he said yes. So I hope that gives you a bit of an idea of how the Libyan government is basically tackling the entire environmental and climate crisis. There is no representation for youth or representation for the Libyan people for that matter. But I really think it's because of lack of organization, as there is so many people who are active in the environmental field here in Libya, but they still haven't managed to come together as one entity. I know a lot of people would say no, but like you can have so many organizations, but it's different. What I mean is that you need a unified voice in order to get the attention of the government, in order for the government to take the climate crisis more seriously. So in that sense, it is the youth's duty, because it is us who are mostly affected by the climate crisis. And that's why we shouldn't be expecting much from the older generations. So this is a bit of my experience here working as a climate activist here in Libya and in regards to COP. But since we're going to be talking more about it later on, as I see in the agenda, then I will share further more about it later.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nisa, for highlighting briefly how youth climate activism looked like in Libya and how distant the government is from any climate related action or even policy. But now let's move to Nasreen, and I would love to know from her experience chairing the Youth Assembly, and especially in Sudan. Can you tell us about your experience as a climate activist in your country and how important it is for youth to be involved in climate advocacy?
Thank you very much, Malak. I think I'm the oldest in the panel. I started climate activism 10 years ago, to be precise, January 2012. And in this 10 years and 10 months almost, I think I see things changed a lot to the positive, yet is a very slow movement. We were very few in the region who actually worked and cared about climate change, and I think having more and more people coming and joining the movement is really great. I want to also highlight what Rawa, I think, mentioned earlier, that being a negotiator doesn't mean that you should stop being an activist. It's just that using different tools. I've been a negotiator since 2016, and I've been formally with the African Group of Negotiators since 2018. But since 2012, I did not stop my climate activism until now. So actually you can do both together. It's just that how we say it in Arabic, لكل مقام مقال. So it depends actually on what to say and how to say it and where are you going to say it. So there's times where you should be the activist, and there's times where you should be the diplomatic negotiator. Well, having new blood and new negotiation processes in different countries is a must, as all of the previous speakers mentioned. Yet different countries have different situations, and I think for example, in Tunisia, the ministry started the young negotiator program. In Libya, I think he's Mohamed Mar'i, if I'm not mistaken, in Bonn, decided to go and talk with the government representative of Libya there. In other countries, we had to actually demonstrate in order to be able to be part of the delegation. And I mean, different countries respond to the youth request in different ways. The most important is we continue our work and continue diversity, our tools that we use for climate activism. As the chair of the Secretary General's Youth Advisory Group on Climate Change, and I have to say this is just a title. I'm not sharing anything. We are 7, and all of us, the 7 of us, actually do a great job in different topics and different specialties. Well, one important thing to mention is that UN as a multilateral body is still not very much friendly to young people, as I see. Being the advisor for the Secretary General, we were trying very much to make it more friendly, even within the UNFCCC. Although, for example, UNFCCC is more friendly than the Security Council, etc., etc. So I guess it depends on how how you deal with the situation, and how your country is dealing with young people is very important. But the most important of all is you don't give up at all, even if you didn't have a space.
Thank you so much, Nasreen. Definitely. I mean, you all have, you all simply highlighted almost the same points, that even though activism and the situation for youth in terms of climate policy or climate action is different for each country in the MENA region, it can show you not only the complexity, but how diverse the situation is when we talk about climate change, given that COP is coming up soon. But indeed, you all highlighted that youth have been persistent in terms of demanding and sharing their voice, and to make sure that their messages are heard regardless of lacking governments or even lack of support and so on. This will lead me to the second round of our questions to our speakers, and these are going to be more focused in each country and in their roles as climate activists and advocates. So my question will go now for Rawa. So Rawa, as one of Tunisia's young climate negotiators, what are young people in Tunisia demanding ahead of COP27? And what kind of climate policy are you hoping to see Tunisia advocate for or commit to at the conference?
Thank you, Malik. Actually, Tunisian youth have recently organized two climate camps, two events that are amazingly led by youth, and wherein we discussed climate national and international policies. They also, tackled the climate cause from different perspectives, scientific, cultural, and even artistic. And by the end of the two camps, they were drafting some kind of youth statement and policy briefs. So what I'm trying to say is that Tunisian youth have been advocating to declare climate emergency. And if you ask me, personally, I would say water emergency in the first place, because we're suffering from severe drought in Tunisia, and I believe it's the same case in Libya. And though the socio-economic situation might not be that favorable now currently, I still believe that climate change must be immediately acknowledged and recognized at the political level. Climate is a cross-cutting theme, and therefore it is not only the affair of, say, the Ministry of the Environment or that of Agriculture and Hydraulic Resources. And so we are asking to prioritize the climate cause. Likewise, the narrative of youth being the agent of the future should be reconsidered and reviewed, I believe, because I feel like it postpones any robust and prompt action with regards to climate change. So youth are the present and the now, not the future, actually. Now I want to relate this with COP27, and we heard a lot about this COP being an African COP, and I hope it will be so. And we are all aware that Africa contributed the least to climate change, but we are amongst the most affected by it. So basically, finance for adaptation and loss and damage are a priority here. Now, as we know that adaptation finance needs are set to grow to over 300 billion USD annually by 2030. 50% of all climate finance must go to adaptation. So this does not mean that we will not make any effort to enhance our climate policies in our national context, but the global north, G20, is overwhelmingly responsible for climate damage. And so its historical responsibility should be assumed. Still, like I'm a bit afraid that these, this year, the negotiation for this year will not be that smooth, because having in mind the geopolitical situation, the war between Russia and Ukraine, the energy crisis, the refugee crisis, all of these issues will definitely influence the negotiations. And so our task as countries from the global south will not be that easy. So we shall also advocate, besides adaptation and loss and damage finance, we shall also advocate for more climate empowerment and capacity building for youth, especially in scientific research and technology. whether by providing the necessary finance or working on mechanisms and tools, institutional reforms that allow youth to be more engaged in the decision-making process. I mean, which actually will be discussed on the table of negotiation as part of the Glasgow 10-year program on action for climate empowerment. So here, what I'm trying to say is that empowering youth is in itself an investment. Decision makers have to understand this very well.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Rawa. It's you highlighted a really important aspect, is that youth are now the present of our time, and we're not talking about just a future from a futuristic perspective, as governments are trying to highlight, especially in the MENA region. But it's important to give space to youth within the climate policy and decision-making space, and hopefully we will see what kind of outcomes are going to come out of the negotiations during COP this year. My question now is for Nisa. So Nisa, you are a dedicated advocate for a gender lens on environmental and climate change issues. What does it mean to advocate climate justice and gender equality together? And how are they connected? And what kind of relevant policies should government in the region be enhancing?
This is a very common question I get, which is how are these two are connected? So it's, as you know, climate change affects the food system, the ecosystem, the socioeconomic system, health, welfare, and of course is a main driver for conflict and displacement, which is my main area of focus. But because of all of that, women and girls are at a higher risk for gender-based violence from climate change related issues. So what I'm trying to say is, when we're talking about the gender aspect of climate, we're not saying that climate itself is like has its own form of a challenge or a new challenge. We're talking about the exact same challenges faced by women, but now they're intensified because of climate change. Because as my colleagues mentioned before, it's a cross-cutting issue. So it's obviously is affecting health, for example. It is affecting socio-political issues. So if you look at gender in every single, from every single aspect of the things that we mentioned, women are at higher risk of gender-based violence. So for example, we all know that women in general, everywhere, but specifically in the global south, are subjected to patriarchal system, or basically they're looked at from a patriarchal lens, where they are automatically the caregivers in their community. So because of that, when we're talking about them being in charge of a household, we're talking about also how they distribute the resources among the people within that household, things such as food and water. So in rural areas, for example, and this is one of the most common examples that is used to explain how gender is affected by climate change, is that women need to travel, for example, to areas to get water in those women in rural areas need to travel further to get water for their families. They also need to, for example, care for land that is owned by the family. So as climate change is intensifying and we have all these resources becoming at scarcity, so these women are going beyond their abilities to provide for their families, putting themselves at risk. And if you're up to date to the latest UN reports, you'd see that they've given specific examples, for example, how women in Bangladesh are being affected by these issues and being subjected to sexual harassment and exploitation because of like the routes that they need to take in order to attain these resources that are becoming more of a scarcity. And then you have conflict and displacement, which is also affecting the whole sexual exploitation matter. And of course, the economic aspect, since women are they do underpaid labor or unpaid labor most of the time. So when we're talking about how one is affecting the other, it's not a direct effect, rather that way that the economy and everything else is affected by climate change, it just further intensifies the issues that women are facing. and therefore is becoming a form of gender-based violence. So that's how they're relating to each other.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
You asked about
yeah, and I also asked about we know how now you explained how they're connected, but what kind of relevant policies should governments in the region be enacting? If you can brief us on that perspective in terms of policies.
Well, there's two parties here, which is the government and most women-led organizations. So the thing about that is that gender-based violence, for example, received less than 1% of the entire humanitarian funds, less. So now that we have all these issues caused by climate change, and we still have this small amount of funding that's going towards gender-based violence without putting climate change effects into consideration. So in this aspect, we're going to be talking about the support that needs to be given to women-led organizations in order for them to put this into perspective and actually help the people who are affected by climate. So I would say engaging women or women-led organizations in the emergency preparedness planning and directly fund and support their work to respond to the slow onset of these emergencies. I would say that we need to ensure equal participation of women human rights defenders in the decision-making process, and allocating also human resources, technical specialists, and expertise in order to support this effective response and mitigation to prevent gender-based violence in climate change.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Nisa. I mean, highlighting the gender aspect of climate change is not a separate issue. And when you mentioned rural areas, for instance, and that's why there should be more focus on discussing, and not just discussing, but negotiating loss and damage aspect in terms of finance and what it means for women, especially in the MENA region. But now my question will go to Nasreen. So Nasreen, last year at COP26, you gave a passionate speech on Africa Day, speaking out against the military coup in Sudan, which prevented your Prime Minister, Abdullah Hamdok, from participating and calling out the lack of meaningful progress made by African leaders. What is on the agenda this year that you hope to see meaningfully addressed? What would it take for this year to be different, particularly taking into account the continued role of the military in Sudan? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, the leader of the military coup is going to represent Sudan as the head of the country this year at COP. It's so sad, yet it's the reality. The question that we should be asked to everyone is, what are the military actually doing to the climate change and to the environment in general, to be able to represent countries in such conferences? Well, in Sudan in general, one of the problems that we are actually having is access to electricity. Only 30% of the population have access to electricity, which means that 70% of the population don't have access to electricity. The 70% depends highly on the biomass, and biomass I mean charcoal, wood charcoal. The process of getting the charcoal and using it is actually 3 times damage to the environment. First of all, they need to cut the trees, and this is deforestation in order to get the woods. Secondly, they have to burn the wood. This is emissions of the CO2 in order to get the charcoal. And third, to burn the charcoal itself to make fire or to cook or to heat water or whatever. These 3-in-1 damage process is done mainly by the protection of the military groups in different areas in Sudan, especially around the forests. The other thing is that they actually cut the tree on purpose in many places in order to be able to see. This is the same tactic that a lot of Russian army did actually on the border of Ukraine, where there's a lot of forest and trees there. So they are actually double harming. I'm not talking now about the good governance problem and structure. Of course, without a good governance, there's no climate governance. And the climate governance need the same 4 pillars for environmental governance and good governance. Of course, political will, strong institutes, laws, legislations, and policies regarding climate change, and the stakeholder engagement. And now, because of the political instability, Sudan is not able to reach a lot of climate finance and climate funds. A lot of sanctions are coming back into their place. How can I say, the quality and the performance of all of the governmental institutes went very, very much behind. And of course, it's a total damage, not mentioning the democracy situation, the freedom of speech, and the freedom of gathering. We luckily had the opportunity to organize the local COI, the local conference of youth in Sudan this year by the efforts of various young people, and it was a great success. Yet, what is the chances of actually making these promises come into reality if we continue the same way? The other question is, not only in Sudan, but I mean, following the international situation, I mean, Lula won the election in Brazil, and we all know that Lula is a great advocate for climate change, unlike Bolsonaro, who was very much horrible when it comes to environmental conservation and dealing with the indigenous communities in Brazil. Chile also elected a very great leader. Also, Colombia had a very nice, great leader now, and all of them will, along with other countries, will actually make Latin America make the most of the climate finance and climate funds, just like what happened during Kyoto Protocol when the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanisms, happened. And a lot of times the excuses for not accessing climate finance are, number one, you don't have enough capacities in countries that can actually absorb climate finance. Secondly, corruption and bad governance structure in the countries. And third, sanctions. And I mean sanctions, especially the countries like Sudan, where we were under the sanction of United States since 1996 because of also wrong decisions of the previous regime. So it's all interlinked together. The role of young people, how much spaces do we have in their countries, how much emphasis and influence that we can have as civil society, but also as a climate advocates, how much we can influence peace and security in the country, because of course climate change is one of the reasons and the gross root causes of conflict in many areas in Sudan and also many areas in the sub-Saharan Africa specifically. It's very complicated, as you mentioned. Of course, the geopolitics. Even me speaking this is a bit complicated because a lot of organizations, sometimes we are Eastern Africa, sometimes we're just Sudan. So yeah, it's a lot of complications, but the only thing we have to do is to keep hope and we continue our work.
Thank you so much, Nasreen, for your detailed answer. I mean, political will is an important factor when we talk about climate policies and action, but at the same time, the environment is used as a multiplier for conflict or even to impose threat in certain communities. So the interconnection between different aspects, especially within the geopolitical sphere, is really important. Now, my last question for this round is for Gina. So Gina, if you can explain to us, especially that Lebanon currently has no president or fully empowered government, entering a period of deepened political crisis on top of its economic and financial collapse, what does its participation at COP27 look like under these circumstances? And what, from a youth perspective, are you hoping Lebanon is able to accomplish at COP27?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Malak. So while the entire world faces unprecedented and interconnected challenges, Lebanon also faces many additional compound challenges as we are witnessing several concurrent crises. The effects are widespread, and amongst those to suffer first are the nation's youth. One issue that has become more urgent throughout the years is that of climate change and the environment. If we don't address them soon, these two issues, they will have further negative impact on several key sectors in Lebanon, including agriculture, the economy, the food sector, the water sector, the energy sector, just to name a few. So what do we do? Yes, of course, we should focus on adaptation. We know that, but diversifying the economy, nobody speaks about that because most economies in the global north are already diversified. wars. That's a big part of achieving climate justice, is to stop wars. And in the region, we are infested with those. And I am not only talking exclusively about Lebanon with these points. I'm also talking about the Arab region, the economic crises that are happening in the Arab world in all of our countries. And then there's occupation. We cannot talk about climate justice without ending the occupation. How can we even mitigate or adapt when we don't have ownership of our own land? These are very context-specific issues to the Arab world. And as my colleagues just mentioned, militarization, wars, occupation, these are all absent from the COPs. We need these issues to be addressed. Financing at the bare minimum, we expect that initiatives led by the youth, like the ones I just mentioned in the previous question, must also play a role and must gain the financial support needed. This is what we expect the COP to achieve. No more ambitions and pledges and commitments. We need to see these issues implemented, these ambitions and pledges and commitments. We need action. And also, to make things worse, I want to mention a Greenpeace report that was published yesterday, in which it said the Middle East and the North Africa region is warming nearly twice as fast as the global average. And this region is particularly vulnerable to the effects and impact of climate change, including extreme water scarcity, which is already a very big issue in our region. So we need climate justice from world leaders at COP27 in the form of the creation and funding of a loss and damage finance facility to compensate vulnerable communities that have been devastated by the climate crisis, and to start implementing the existing pledges for adaptation and mitigation. Funding should also be in the form of grants and not loans. I don't know if I answered your question. Was there another part?
Yeah, no, thank you so much. Gina, you answered it perfectly, because it's important when we address COP that regardless of being a universal event that will have different stakeholders discussing the climate crisis, but you highlighted definitely the injustice that is there within COP. What's important to be highlighted, especially for youth in terms of finance and so on, but inclusivity is also important to take into account. So this will take me to the third round of our questions, the inclusion of youth at COP and beyond. So my first question from this round is for Rawa. This year's COP27 has promised to be different in terms of platforming young people and amplifying their demands. Yet it is being held in Egypt, a country with an alarming human rights record and extremely restricted civic space. What challenges or restrictions are MENA youth facing now to attend and participate in the conference?
That's super interesting question, Malik. I mean, we noticed recently that youth engagement is improving. I mean, compared to the previous years. So youth movements, climate movements has grown all over the world. And perhaps this year, I guess we have the first future youth and future generation pavilion at COP. And we have also many other side events and workshops that are related to future generation, to capacity building, to youth empowerment, and so on and so forth. However, I mean, some civil society activists has complained a lot about restrictions, which is actually paradoxical. And of course, such restrictions is not in our interest as MENA youth. I mean, we need as much youth from the MENA region as possible to exchange and network together. And MENA youth has to be, I mean, we need to be well represented in those international events. We have our own heroines and heroes. We have our own narratives that are worth shared by media, just like the other youth from the global north, so that we make sure that we are noted and heard and not left behind. Another major challenge, I mean, besides those restrictions, is, I believe, the funding for our participation. I mean, our participation in such events depends on funding, and if funds are not provided, our continuity as a group will be definitely hindered. And so governments should take that into consideration And again, as I said earlier, invest in youth. What is also important is now how to act on this gap, how to keep those who did not manage to attend COP27 for one reason or another, to keep them involved and well updates. I can think about hybrid events, for example. I mean, they can be like a good idea. For example, using social media, live streaming sessions, events, and so on and so forth. Also, what is even more important is hosting post-COP sessions and events to discuss the outputs and the challenges is also relevant. It will be relevant, I mean, to bridge, the gap between those, the privileged who managed to attend COP and those who are left behind because of those restrictions or because of financial difficulties and so on and so forth.
Thank you so much,
Now,
Rawa. You want to highlight another point in terms of restrictions for COP from this year? Yeah, go ahead.
Just one final key message. I believe that many youth are present in these sessions. So, I mean, we as youth, we should not limit ourselves to COP, but rather we should think beyond COP to create like some sort of youth-led platforms wherein we exchange good practices, especially in terms of scientific research and technology. Otherwise said, we need to boost our South-South cooperations. I mean, but this does not, of course, mean that we should neglect international cooperation. But for any cooperation to be effective, it should be built on partnership, mutual trust, and equity, which is not always the case, as we all know.
Thank you so much, Rawa. You highlighted really important aspects when we talk about challenges, but you also mentioned having looking beyond COP. Usually, many look at Beyond as the greatest event for the next 2 weeks, but it's important to make sure that if some people are not having the opportunity to attend, there should be a hybrid or maybe an online aspect that can include as many youth as possible. It's important to keep the momentum going even after COP, which is usually neglected or forgotten by many, especially in terms of governments and so on within the MENA region. My question now will go for Nasreen. So Nasreen, you have been a powerful advocate for youth inclusion in global climate policy making. How can youth voices be more meaningfully included at COP27 this year and in the coming years, and in climate policy making more generally?
Thank you, Meg, for this question. Well, one of the experiences that we got as advisors for the Secretary General, but also from the different years of the experience in the field, one of the very important and very powerful spaces to interact with world leaders is actually COP. So I think one of the very important steps this year, the COP presidency is planning roundtables where young representatives, I hope young, but they did not say so. But when world leaders, different head of states, different prime ministers, different senior decision makers in different countries meet each other, they call it the discussion roundtables. The first 2 days will be all about high-level roundtables. I really hope that we have enough representation of young people in these roundtables, although until now I don't think this is the situation. Well, having these young people in these places is not only important for the movement as a climate change, but it's also important to break the ice that we have as young people towards the world leaders and the opposite. They think we are just there to make problems, to demonstrate. We don't have articulated ideas. We don't want to actually help solving the problems. We just want to protest all the time, which is of course not true. A lot of young people have a very great ideas and very innovative ways and approaches, and they are actually very much committed to actually do it and save the planet. But we also sometimes, a lot of young people think that it's very easy for head of states to do things like just click a finger and then everything will change. And of course, this is not it's not that easy. They have to consider their people. They have to consider the lower and marginalized groups. They have to consider the votes. They have to consider a lot of things that we might not be important for us as activists, but it is definitely important for them as politicians. So I think having this ice melted and saying that, yeah, we know as world leaders you have challenges, we understand that it's not easy. As the previous speakers all mentioned, we have different kind of crises, economical, health, geopolitics, everything. But we can help. We are the solution for that. Just give us an eye, give us an ear, so we can actually implement this together. I think this is a very important step, that we are still a lot far from it. I mean, it's very rare to have a head of state or a senior decision maker in a country who actually meaningfully listen to young people and actually start together to implement some plans to stop climate change impacts to their people and their communities.
Thank you so much, Nasreen. Bridging this gap and making connection as valid as possible between decision makers, especially seniors and youth, is really important. And as you mentioned, it's still considered an issue, even if on paper or even on image, they show that they are including or trying to include youth as many as possible. But in the negotiations, it's important to break that ice and to open space, provide space for youth to actually speak, not only demand, but share insights and discuss with policy makers to make the best out of the negotiations. And now we're still in the inclusion of youth during COP. My question, the same question will go for Gina and Nisa, but I'll start with Nisa. How are climate advocates who are not attending COP by choice or because they're prevented access planning on engaging during COP? What are some alternatives to in-person engagement or even alternative routes to youth inclusion in global policymakers outside of COP?
Okay, so first of all, I'm not attending COP by choice. I did receive funding to attend some of the side events that are taking place at COP. And, I was one of the activists who received some invitations to speak at these side events. I decided not to go because, to be completely honest, I sort of lost my belief, or the COP itself lost its credibility to me. I'm trying to think about it in the sense that, looking back at my experience in Milan last year, all the youth came together to write down the manifesto, which was supposed to be discussed at COP last year. So when we finished writing down the draft, it looked pretty good. But in the end, they asked us to make all these amendments over and over. Why? Because they wanted the policy recommendation to sound good enough so that the politicians would consider it. But when we finished it, it was already good. But when we made all these amendments to make it sound so good for the politician, it sort of lost its essence. And then these documents are being presented at COP. For me, COP deviated from the point of why we're having it in the first place, and it became something like World Cup, where states wants to host it just because they want to advocate for the work that they don't actually do on the ground. So it's sort of like a propaganda thing. I'm not saying that we shouldn't go to COP and we shouldn't be part of it. Obviously, we have to be there, especially like we said before, since most activists in the global south, nobody knows exactly what we do. We don't have the same coverage that is, that other activists in the north have. Therefore, if we're not there to talk about our issues, no one will. But at the same time, when I saw that, for example, Coca-Cola sponsoring the event and all of that stuff happening, I was like, okay, I see where this is going. This is just a publicity stunt. So I chose not to go. And in terms of like what people can do or young people can do to take part in these policy making, that's why I mentioned my experience at Milan last year. I think you have to bring together the youth of yours in your state and work on it from the bottom up, rather than focusing so much on the global the global arena. Why? Because most of these policies that you will write or help writing are not going to be presented the same way it was discussed, where you actually wrote it, or in the same way that you guys agreed. They will change things. So in the end, you will get the same result, just pretty much nothing. So you have to take things into your own hands, even if it comes to like write down the policy recommendation. Who do you team up with? It needs to be done on a local level. If you can get to your state and pressure them, but to actually focus on the global aspect, none of the things that you will write will actually reach the right audience.
Thank you so much, Nisa. I mean, you mentioned the local level, and sometimes it's usually forgotten, because when we talk about climate change, we will think about it from a global perspective in terms of COP and how the world in general can do something to push certain policies forward. But we need to stress on the role of youth, even within a local level, and how we can actually implement or support the policy making, or even pressure on the ground within our communities, which our many youth are still doing, regardless of them attending or not attending COP this year. The same question is for Gina. So for climate advocates who are not attending COP by choice, or those prevented access, what are some alternatives to in-person engagement, or even alternative routes to youth inclusion in global policymaking outside of COP?
Yes, thank you, Malak. First of all, I would like to salute Nisa, because I totally support what you said. It's 100% true. It rings all kinds of bells, and as also as Nisa said, it doesn't matter if the youth are participating or not. There's always something that can be done, and some effect that you can bring to the world without attending these huge conferences. But I also would like to say that even with all the restrictions that are being imposed on the participation in COP this year, if I've understood correctly, there are over like 130 different registered and accredited youth organizations that are attending the COP, which I think is a very good number. And I think it's a very nice representation as well, because then some action can happen inside, and some, the pressure can come from inside of the COP. There's also the Youth and Future Generations Day on November 10th inside the COP for those who are attending. It would also be great to take part in that. Now, for those who don't want to go to the COP, or who couldn't make it, or who are just not attending the COP for one reason or another, there are a multiple of online events taking place throughout the duration of the COP, and before and after that. I can share some links to some of these events in the chat, maybe, or later somehow. There's also the UNFCCC has something called COP TV, which is an online platform for scientists, innovators, activists from around the world, where they can tune in and follow the action happening inside the COP directly. There's also the Global Landscapes Forum. They have their own online summit where everybody can register and attend virtually. And the Conference of the Youth, as my fellow panelists have mentioned already, where many young people who could not secure funding or accreditation for the COP got registered for the COI, the Conference of the Youth, which is also an annual event under the banner of YONGO, and it is the largest and longest running youth event to date. This year it's the 17th conference, COI 17. But of course, there are also other initiatives like the ones we've already mentioned, my fellow panelists and myself, in the past 1 hour, happening in our different countries, different areas of the world, that are led by the youth, managed by the youth, initiated by the youth, due to their own needs, because the youth today, they know what they want, they know what they need, they are aware of climate change and its impacts. So yeah, I mean, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. It's important. I mean, thank you so much for all your answers throughout the panel, and the points that you highlighted that reflect directly to the reality in the MENA region, and how the region, in terms of youth climate activists, as an overview looks like, but also what kind of challenges youth have been facing, what kind of demands youth want to see in COP. And there was a few points that were mentioned throughout the panel in terms of media coverage and so on, injustice within COP and outside of COP. But now we will take a few questions from the Q&A for the rest of our session. And I want to answer I want to ask this question to Rawa, which is linked to the media coverage. So what are some of the challenges activists face with respect to media coverage in climate change related issues?
Thank you, Malik. An interesting question, actually. We all know that media, it's about narratives. And mainstream media, most of it practically perpetuates a narrative on young people, but from the global north, not really from the global south. And here we have to make sure to step in and to tell our stories, to reveal ourselves more, so that we will be able to be heard and noticed in this huge narrative of youth and climate change. So basically, MENA, youth in the MENA region, we have specific needs, like we have our own local stories that worth to be mentioned and shared as well. And so we have to be careful with regards to media coverage as far as youth is concerned. Also, we have to be careful from another narrative, which is youth washing, or the belief, as I said earlier, that youth is about the future and so on and so forth. Actually, it's about the now. It's about the present and not the future. So we read always on media that the climate issue is about the future and so on and so forth. Again, the third aspect, I think we have also to be careful from greenwashing as well. And Anissa, she mentioned Coca-Cola being the provider, the sponsor of COP. And so we have also to be careful while reading articles, any other materials provided by media. Yeah, I think these are the three major aspects with regards to media coverage and climate change.
Thank you so much, Rawa. We have so many questions in the Q&A section, and I have this question, and I would like to ask it to Nasreen. So, Nasreen, my question here is for you from Elaine Nonman. Many governments, especially developed countries, come to COP with predetermined commitments that mostly limit their responsibility. Are your groups doing advocacy to demand rethinking, improving government commitments, especially for reparations between COP convenings?
Yes. So I lost you for a second, Malik. Can you please repeat the question? Sorry.
Yes, definitely. So we had this question. Many governments, especially developed countries, come to COP with predetermined commitments that mostly limit their responsibility. Are your groups doing advocacy to demand rethinking, improving government commitments, especially for reparations between COP convenings?
Yes, definitely. This is one of the major roles of the negotiators, is to actually make the developed countries raise their ambition and commit more. There is two things. Number one, unfortunately, in the recent years, we have been betrayed actually by one of our own, one of the developing countries. And for example, last year in Glasgow, the language of the final text was phasing out of fossil fuel by a push of India, Saudi Arabia, Brazil, and Russia. I think it was moved from phasing out to phasing down fossil fuel. Another thing is, I remember the Prime Minister of India said that India will be carbon neutral by 2070. So I met him in another event and I asked him, do you think you will be alive in 2070? And he looked at me And he said, probably not. I was like, okay, then why do you commit things that you know that you will not be alive for? I really think that different world leaders and different country leaders should only be able to commit things by the end of their term. Um, Other than this, we never know, because what Obama promised was all destroyed by Trump, for example, and now Biden spent the last 2 years trying to fix what um, Trump did, etc., etc. So the engagement and the pledges by the different communities and different countries actually very much depend on their political will and the political situation in the country.
Thank you so much, Nasreen, for bringing this up. It's really important. And I think many governments, for instance, do not take into account the government that will take the lead afterwards and what kind of measures they will put, or even fixed or even not fixed, in terms of like climate policy and climate action. We have another question, and I would like to ask it to Nisa. So how can we alleviate concerns about the impact public corruption has on prospective climate-related investments and financing? Should there be alternative non-governmental institutions set up in order for local communities and initiatives to access climate finance when government institutions are dysfunctional? If so, what would that look like, and how often are they raised at international climate negotiations? The question to Nisa, if you would like to take this one.
Malak, if I may jump until Nisa come back, there's a question I really need to go. That's why I need to answer very quickly.
Yeah, definitely.
The last question was about networks that brings together youth from the MENA region. Well, there is networks, yet how inclusive it is, this is the question. There is the Climate Action Network Arab World. There is a Greenpeace Arab World. There is a lot of movements, and there is the I think previously there was the AYMCA, which is the Arab Youth Movement on Climate Change. But how inclusive it is, how sustainable it is, all of these are questions that we need to ask ourselves. So I think we need to build stronger and more sustainable networks among ourselves, and let's see how things move forward. And if any wants to cooperate in building this movement, please feel free to reach me out. And I think we can, if you are also going to COP, please also feel free to reach me out. There's a MENA Youth COP participants group, WhatsApp group. I can also add you to. I think there's a lot of coordination need to be happening. Thank you, and I really need to leave. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nasreen, for your intervention. There's another question that I would like to ask to Rawa. So one of the downsides of creating youth spaces is that youth stay in those spaces and don't engage with older decision makers. How do MENA climate youth advocates enter the decision-making space, and what is being done to ensure that happens?
I think our colleague answered this question by saying that it goes both sides. So the older generation, adults, should not underestimate youth and think of them as being troublemakers. On the other side, youth themselves should trust adults to some extent, and do not think of them being like the bad guy always. So both of us, the two generations have to make an effort to meet somehow at some middle point here. And as I said earlier, being a negotiator, being in the system does not mean that I'm giving up on my stature as a climate activist. So I think this is the point here, how to make a balance between being within the system and being an activist outside of it. So, I mean, to achieve intergenerational equity, we have to work on this balance, to how to bridge the gap, because because we need adults' experiences as well, and we need youth views and fresh perspectives. So basically here, from their side, governments should try their best, invest in youth, as I said, to make their youth more implicated and engaged in the decision-making process. Youth, from their side, they have to seize every single opportunity, not just to sit back there and say, oh, we're not involved, we're not included. But once you had the chance to be involved and included, you should come up to the table with ideas, with perspectives. So here's my message for both adults and youth.
Thank you so much, Rawa. We have almost the same question, and I would like to take Gina's perspective on this. What do you believe should be done to have more youth voices included in decision-making and climate policy, given your experience in activism in Lebanon?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, we have youth already working on developing some policies, fixing or suggesting some, ways to fix some of the existing climate policies we have in Lebanon. But how to make these policies more, heard, their work more known? I think they should have more connections with the government, with the authorities, the relevant officials. They should be able, we don't have freedom of speech. We don't have freedom of speech problems in Lebanon, excuse me. But we also do not have, most of the time, we don't have a government present. So like currently we have a caretaker government. We don't have a proper, functioning official government. So it's not very easy to connect and have your voices heard where it is relevant, but again, just to say that it's not all doom and gloom. The youth are doing some work. They're being very innovative, very creative in some areas. But I think this liaison with the government should be a bit more highlighted and emphasized. And of course, funding. It's always about more funding, more opportunities in that area.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing your insight. We have a really interesting question that I would like to direct it to Nisa, if possible, linked to the gender aspect in climate. So Nisa, this question here from one from the audience. The panelists are women, non-binary individuals. Is the climate movement liberatory for women's activism, where fighting for gender rights explicitly is more restrictive? So if Nisa, maybe she has some connection problems or audio problems, maybe we can take Rawa and Gina's insights on this. So Rawa, if you want to tackle this aspect, the gender aspect, please.
Well, I think Nisa, she elaborated well on this issue. Gender again is a cross-cutting theme, and so it should be included in all climate policies. We talk a lot about vulnerability, but I think we should talk about differentiated vulnerabilities. For example, I mentioned an adaptation, and for example, we have like the global goal of adaptation this year, and the issue here is how to develop indicators and metrics to measure and quantify adaptation. I think gender should be included within those metrics and indicators so that we make sure that adaptation is just and inclusive. So, women and girls in the MENA region are more vulnerable because they are already marginalized economically, socially, culturally. And so climate change further intensifies those vulnerabilities. So I think the most affected ones should be at the heart of any climate policy. That is, the more marginalized, the more they have to be included within any decision-making process, because, as I said, they have their own local circumstances that should be taken into account.
Thank you so much, Rawa. And Gina, if you want to add on this perspective, especially in terms of higher restrictions on women, how is it like from a gender perspective within the climate in pushing forward climate policies and in terms of like youth activism?
Yeah, I don't have much to add to my colleagues here, except that, of course, women and young girls are much more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and they are the least ones to get compensated for these vulnerabilities and for these impacts. There are so many different layers and layers and layers of different vulnerabilities that we are exposed to when it comes to climate change and all of its different impacts that are not even considered when we talk about climate change and its impacts and climate justice and social justice and all of that. So yeah, I mean, I don't have much to add. My colleagues just covered everything, I guess. I just wanted to emphasize this. And there are lots of studies and reports on this already. So maybe not enough, but there are some that can be studied.
Thank you so much. We have a question since COP is coming up in the next few days. A number of journalists are tuning into the session. What advice would you give them as they cover climate change issues and as they cover COP27 specifically? So Rawa, what kind of advice would you share with journalists covering COP?
I'm not a journalist. I'm not an expert even in media, but I think they have to be authentic and to cover what is really there. To be somehow, I don't want to use this word, but as much neutral as possible to cover what is really going out there. Yeah.
And Gina, what is your advice to journalists covering COP this year?
I don't know, off the top of my head, I guess, don't just follow what sells, like cover the real stories, follow the vulnerable communities and the talks about vulnerable communities, and cover those with, like in-depth stories about those issues rather than what gets you more clicks, what's fashionable.
Exactly. I mean, when covering COP or climate-related issues, it's important to be as inclusive as possible in terms of stories, and that you make sure you cover different aspects and include different parts of the society, not only focusing from a governmental perspective, but also covering marginalized groups, what kind of success stories even are present, because usually the MENA region is addressed, for instance, from I would say, from a concern perspective rather than even success stories. And we don't see a lot of examples that showcase the potential of the region. So it's important to highlight different aspects of climate-related issues, but also during COP to make sure that you're covering different stakeholders. We have a question here. So what types of climate-related damages do you see in your country and across the region? If any wants to interfere on this.
I can interfere.
Yes,
I think, yeah, for Tunisia, and I think for basically the MENA region, it's water. So we're suffering from severe droughts, and I'm the daughter of a farmer, and so I'm seeing the impact of climate change like basically every day. And I think water should be, we have like climate, but I think water should have a specific focus. Even in COPs, I mean, there's like the water pavilion and other international days for water, but I think water should lay at the heart of any adaptation strategy, because our future and our present is at stake.
Thank you so much, Rawa. And for Gina, I will ask you the second part of this question. How are you connecting local experiences with the international coalitions and calls for loss and damage financing, given that it has had some momentum last year, but it was not really pushed by developed countries. So how these are connected from a local experience with the international coalitions in this specific topic?
Yeah. So from my experience, which isn't vast in this area, to be honest, but we are in Lebanon. We are doing some small local projects in coastal towns on loss and damage adaptation mitigation. Some small initiatives, with vulnerable coastal communities, because the coastal communities are the most hardly hit and they're on the first line of defense, against stormy weathers and all that. So and then we're connecting those with our wider networks. We are Diaries of the Ocean is part of different regional and international networks, and we connect our experiences. We share them. We learn from others. I mean that's it. I don't think I've answered your question, but this is what I have.
Thank you so much. I mean, we're reaching the end of our session today. I would like to thank our speakers for your interventions, for your clear and direct answers, for describing the reality of youth climate activists and advocates from your experience, but also highlighting important advice and also important notes to cover ahead of COP27. So I would like to thank you all for your intervention and your time today. It was my pleasure.
Yes, we're reaching the end. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Nisreen, Gina, and Nisa, for an in-depth and extremely timely conversation that is much needed ahead of COP27. And thank you, Medic, for thoughtfully guiding and moderating this conversation. I want to reiterate to our audience that today's conversation is part of a larger body of work on and commitment to the urgent issue of climate change in the MENA region. And we invite you to continue to follow TimeUp's COP Comes to MENA project, climate change project, which unpacks the most pressing issues of climate change in the region, including what challenges the region is facing, strategies for adaptation and mitigation, first person stories and interviews, and COP and the international community. And as well as the wonderful work that each of our panelists are doing on the ground in the region among youth-led organizations and initiatives. So thank you so much again to our audience for joining us and contributing so much to the discussion. You can follow TimeUp on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn to stay engaged and find our panelists here as well. And for any media requests, you can reach out by email to press@timeup.org. And finally, you'll find this recording on our website and YouTube channel. Thank you again, everyone, and to the TimeUp team who helped make this event possible. Have a wonderful day.